issue of moving the Nigerian corporate governance code system to the national level has become, shall I use the word controversial, over the past few years. So this development is very welcome, and I would like Daniel to please speak a few words to us. I'd like to ask a few questions. Can you give us a brief highlight of the key points in the exposure draft of the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, and in what ways are they different from the suspended code?
In the context of the last two global financial crises, if you like, I think the international community, in coming together and looking at how to strengthen financial systems in countries and internationally, agreed on 12 areas of standards and codes that countries should implement to ensure that financial systems are stronger nationally as well as internationally. And those standards are in 3 areas. I think one in around fiscal transparency. There are also standards around financial sector supervision. And there are standards around market and institutional strength. So in that dimension of market and institutional strengthening, standards were agreed in the areas of payment systems, market infrastructure, accounting and auditing, insolvency and creditor rights, as well as corporate governance. So if you take the area of corporate governance, in terms of an international standard to which countries should aspire to, I think it was agreed that the OECD corporate governance framework was the appropriate standard. So countries were required to take steps to entrench standards and codes that meet that level. But for many years in Nigeria, there was no single regulatory body that looked after corporate governance. So what you did get, so regulators have always been concerned about promoting good standards of corporate governance. So a number of regulators took steps to define governance codes, but they could only propagate those standards within their regulatory purview. So the central bank, for example, had a code of corporate governance for banks. There was one by the insurance regulator. SEC developed a code. So we had a multiplicity of codes for different sectors by different regulators. But the FRC Act, setting up the council, charged it with coordination of matters relating to corporate governance. So for the first time, we had an institution that could pull it all together and come up with a national framework. So that is why we're driving that effort. So it's really to have a national standard. Unfortunately, the output of that effort in 2016 generated a lot of negative feedback from stakeholders, so it was suspended. So we've gone back and done further work. So there's a new code that has just been released in exposure draft form. What is in the new code and how does it differ from the previous one? The new code, in terms of difference, I think primarily what we have now is a principles-based code, as against the previous code, which was rules-based. And in terms of language, a lot of things were mandatory, and it was very prescriptive in a number of areas. For example, minimum size for boards of 8, and specifications as to the mix of independents, executives, and things like that. So we've done a lot of work, engaged with stakeholders. We're not developing the code for FROC, it's a national code, and it's what we agree. So different sectors of the business community have been involved. So we have an exposure draft. It's principles-based. A number of those issues have been addressed differently.
So I think for businesses, one of the things about the new code is that, as Daniel said, we had a multiplicity of codes. So I think, for example, of a listed company, that is because it's a public company, it has to comply with the SEC code. It's a holding company. Then it has subsidiaries, one in the insurance sector and another one in the pension sector. And those ones have to comply with the NICOM and the PENCOM codes respectively. One of the advantages of an FRC code is that holistically, through that type of holding company, there's more certainty and your compliance is not a maze that can become a nightmare because you basically have one major code that you're complying with, and then the way it's supposed to work, which is in accordance with OECD guidelines, is that you will then have the sector regulators providing guidelines that will supplement the code. And I think that that's a neater thing for the businesses. It's more efficient and it makes compliance, I think, less expensive than it is now for the type of a company I gave an example about. Beyond that is also for the businesses that are trying to attract investment. There's also definiteness of what the investor is looking for. So when you come into Nigeria, you know, for example, that the board tenure, there's no board tenure, but for independent non-executive directors, I think the code says 9 years. You know, for example, that in Nigeria, whatever it is that the principle in the code talks about, you have one place to look at it, and then if you need to go into, you can go to the guidelines, and hopefully the regulators will then do a lot of work around the guidelines and have websites and other portals where people can look at things.
In terms of structure, it sets out 28 principles of corporate governance and about 230 practices. So you take each principle, there are a number of practices defined in the code as to how a corporate entity can use those practices to implement that principle. Now, for the entities that will be required to apply the code, there's a reporting requirement, and that reporting requirement will kick in for financial years ending after 1st January 2020. In terms of reporting, the basis is apply and explain. So there will be a presumption that all of the principles have been applied, but it's not sufficient to end there. You then need to explain how you have applied those principles, what you have done, and demonstrate how they meet the requirements of the code. And that's where the sector regulators can also come in terms of those practices. So while the code, for example, does not specify a minimum size of the board, central bank, for example, for prudential reasons, might introduce additional guidelines against that particular principle that talks about balance of the board, and say for prudential purposes, the board of a bank should be a minimum of X and have XYZ roles, okay? So I think, one, it provides a national framework where everything around corporate governance could hang. And nationwide, we can agree on those 28 principles. If we need to increase it or take any one out, there's a basis to have that debate and agreement. And everybody can do things consistent with those principles. In terms of enforcement of the code and ensuring that people live by it, what we're looking for, or what we are looking towards, are market-based incentives for compliance. Because the code, we're holding that out as this is a national standard for good corporate behavior. And companies will provide detailed reports that presumes that they've applied those principles and report back to the marketplace as to how they have implemented those principles, the practices they've used. Today, even without a national code, I mean, many of you would agree that the market discriminates between similar companies on the basis of perceived strengths of corporate governance. Now, when we do have a clearer code, a clearer national code, we're hoping that that market discrimination would even be stronger as a means to compel good behavior or to reward people who are not meeting the standard. So it will, I hope, it will be less about the regulator wielding the big stick on companies. But if the incentives are market-based and people like those of us in this room have a framework to assess the reporting by company to, make a judgment as to how well their governance arrangements are working, I think we would succeed a lot more. So there's a key role in that respect from the investor community.